All right, well, good morning. We are now beginning to look at 1 Corinthians 11. We have looked at a number of the troubles that they had in the church there. You know, all the way back in chapter 1, there were divisions and strife and controversies within the church, and then there were issues with condoning immorality. We learned about that in 1 Corinthians 5, and learned about lawsuits between brethren, and we learned about consciences and how we need to be aware of them. We've learned about idolatry in the past chapter and how much of an issue it was in Corinth. And so now we begin with 1 Corinthians 11, and Paul is giving them instructions and us instructions. In verse 1, he says, "Imitate me just as I also imitate Christ." And of course, that should be our motto as well. I mean, Paul had sins in his life. He had issues in his life, just like every Christian does. But he still says, you know, as I follow Christ in those respects, then follow me. And that's the way all of us should be. So, to quote Paul, would someone read Galatians 2, verse 20 for us? This is about the same idea. Galatians 2, verse 20.
I have been crucified with Christ, and it is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me, and the life which I now live in the flesh I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself up for me.
Okay, there's Paul talking about the same thing to the churches of Galatia about imitating him because Christ lived within him. Of course, when Paul wrote to the church at Corinth, there was still a lot of the New Testament that hadn't been written. And so Paul said, you know, as he lived the Christian life before them, about what he did, what he didn't do, what he said, what he didn't say, then they would have a good idea about how they should live. And again, Paul would say pretty much the same thing to the church in Philippi. You know, what you've seen and heard and watched in me, then you do the same thing. So that is something that is appropriate for all of us. Well, now he goes to another issue in the church at Corinth. This has certainly been an issue among churches of Christ for a long time, and still is in places, about head coverings. And as always, you have to take into account the entire context of the letter that Paul writes. Otherwise, we can come up with ideas that maybe don't fit the context. So there are things we can glean from this that are still appropriate, and probably some things that were specific to the church at Corinth that aren't specific to us. But he says, "Now I praise you, brethren, that you remember me in all things and keep the traditions just as I deliver them to you." And of course, traditions can be used in a positive way and in a negative way. He's obviously talking about a positive way here. In some translations, it's ordinances, but it's the same word in the original language, ordinances and traditions. So these are the inspired teachings, all right, that came through the apostles, but came from God. And so Paul was praising them, even though they had tons of problems at the church. He was still praising them in that they were keeping traditions. They were keeping these inspired teachings, at least some of them. And so he was praising them for doing that very thing because he had delivered many of them to them. And so that was the positive sense, the positive encouragement that he was giving them because he was getting ready to talk about something that had caused problems. So we could just call this the inspired truth, the gospel teachings. And so, at least in many of them, they were doing a good job of keeping them. And so that was something very positive. But I want you to know that the head of every man is Christ, the head of woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. Now, this is something that, of course, is universal and applies to every congregation everywhere. And that's the idea of authority, the idea of submission. Doesn't have anything to do with superiority. Okay, God isn't superior to Christ. We read about that, in Philippians chapter 2. But there is this idea of submission and authority. And that's what 1 Corinthians 11 is about. It's about authority and about submitting to authority. But again, it's not about superiority. I mean, a police officer can stop me for speeding because he has the authority to do it. That doesn't mean he's a better person than me. It just means he has the authority from the government to do that. And then you could do all kinds of examples just like that. So it's not, again, he talks about the woman, the head of every man is Christ, the head of woman is man. That doesn't mean the male is superior to the woman. It means they have different roles. They have different functions. And so this idea of authority, of course, pervades every culture everywhere in the world. There's a list of authority. There are people who have authority over others. All right? The principal at Webb City has authority over me. That's his job. All right? That doesn't mean he's a better person or a superior person. It just means in some ways he has authority and I have to submit to him. And that's the idea of chapter 11. It is about authority and submission, not about superiority. And so he gives the list there. And that list is really what the chapter is about and how that was applied in the city of Corinth. It would be applied very differently today in our culture because our culture in many ways is vastly different than the culture of Corinth. And if you would go to Japan, that would be a vastly different culture too. One of our teachers at Webb, she's partly Japanese and I'm not sure what the other part is. But she had been to Japan and she was talking about how different the culture was and all about their culture. And it's very different. And so 1 Corinthians 11 would be applied, the principle's the same, but it would be applied differently in the Japanese culture. But again, verse 3 is the controlling principle here, and that's about submission and about authority. And how we have to be concerned about this. You want to call it the chain of command. That's kind of what it is. And that is God's arrangement. All right. It wasn't something the church in Corinth came up with. It was something God came up with. That's his, if you want to call it the Godhead, that was their arrangement. Christ repeatedly said, I came into the world not to do my will. All right, he made that very clear, but the will of the Father. So there's that chain of command, there's that authority. Again, not about superiority, but about authority. And so here, the man and the woman have different functions. They have different roles, and that's God's arrangement. And people that try to change that sin against God's arrangement. And so it's not about honor or dishonor or excellence or not. It's simply about that's God's arrangement. And this, now he's given the principle in verse 3. Now pretty much the rest of the chapter, or a good part of the chapter, is about how that principle was applied in the city of Corinth. And again, the city of Corinth would have different applications than the city in Rome, or the city in Jerusalem, or some of those other places. So he says, every man, and again this word is male, every male praying or prophesying, having his head covered, dishonors his head. Well, that was a way of showing authority and submission and what all that was about. And of course, praying and prophesying, these are religious acts of worship or acts of devotion. So that's the context. And again, it's about distinction, about distinguishing between men in worship and women in worship. And he talks about his head covered. He's going to talk about veils and head coverings. And these are more like you see Islamic women wearing. The only thing you can kind of see is their eyes. That's the type of covering he's talking about. He's not talking about a little hat on their head like some people interpret it today. That's a misapplication of what he's talking about. He is talking about a full head covering that covers practically the entire head. So if you believe that is still something you do, then you should, again, look like Muslim women today, or unmarried Muslim women. I think that's the context of Islam. But it's about distinguishing men and women. So he says, a man, if he's wearing a head covering when he's praying or prophesying, that's dishonoring because of what he just said in verse 3. Because he said the head of woman is man, the head of man is Christ. And so it's all about what verse 3 is talking about. It's about that general principle. In the city of Corinth, wearing those, if a woman was out in public without a head covering, that implied something. Doesn't imply that in our culture today at all. It doesn't have any resemblance whatsoever. If you see a woman today at Walmart or at the gas station and she doesn't have a full head covering, that doesn't mean anything to us. So that part of chapter 11 doesn't have anything to do with us. But how we apply it today is very important because of this chain of command. But in the city of Corinth, if you were a Christian woman, you had to be careful about how you appeared. It was very important. You did not want to appear to be an immoral woman, an indecent woman, anything like that. So you wanted to show that you were in subjection to your husband. And you did that in Corinth in the first century by wearing this veil. Because he says in verse 5, but every woman, female, who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. For that is one and the same as if her head were shaved. He says it's just the same. Whether, if you were in the city of Corinth, a lot of like female prostitutes, immoral women would shave their heads. And so if a Christian woman would appear in public with a shaven head, what would you think? Well, you would think she was immoral. So Christian women weren't supposed to do that. It says that dishonors her. All right? So whether you shaved your head or didn't wear the veil, people would think, if you were shaven or if you didn't have the veil, that you were immoral. So he says, for if a woman is not covered, let her also be shorn. See, it's the same thing. That's what he's saying. It's the same thing. If you don't wear a veil, if you're a woman and don't wear a veil, you might as well shave your head, because to people that's going to mean the same thing. So he said, if a woman is not covered, let her also be shorn. It doesn't make any difference. They both have the same implication. But if it's shameful for a woman to be shorn or shaved, let her be covered. And it was. So he says that's why Christian women need to be covered, for that very reason. And again, he goes back and talks about the reason for it. For a man indeed ought not to cover his head, since he's the image and glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. This goes back to verse 3. with the idea of submission. There's that chain of command again. So in that culture, this meant something. When if a man wore a head covering, oh, he was doing something wrong. I mean, a Christian man. So that's why there was this distinction between men and women. And there needed to be that distinction in that culture. They needed to have that distinction.
Well, Bobby, some women in the Church of Christ still do the veil.
No, I know that. Yeah, I know churches that do that throughout the country. And I think they completely misapply what Paul was talking about. Completely. But as long as they don't tell other people it's sinful for them to not wear a veil, then that's fine. That's the idea of what he's talked about back in chapters 8 and 9. Okay, that's fine. But that's kind of like eating the meats offered to idols. It's kind of in the same category. So, again, it's about this authority, making distinctions between men and women and what they're supposed to be doing. And again, it's not about superiority or intelligence or any of that. That was just the way in the first century that they were distinguished. Well, they don't distinguish that in our society like that. Now, maybe if suddenly in a few years they started to do that, then Christian women need to start wearing a veil. But that's not indicative in our world at all about that distinction. That's no distinction today. No one would even think that. But in a Muslim country, and if you were a Muslim woman, that was a big deal. All right, so there's some, again, it's about the custom of the times and the land, and it's very different. But he goes on with the same topic. For man is not from woman, but woman from man. Nor was man created for the woman for the man. This, of course, goes back to the first 3 chapters of Genesis about, God created Adam first, dust of the earth. The first woman was created differently. So even the first man and woman were created differently. And those distinctions are still supposed to be with us. Marriage is only between a male and a female in God's sight. Not any other way. That's not making a distinction. But God has wanted that distinction. He even created them differently. So the woman was created for the man. Remember, he needed a partner, a helpmeet, the Bible calls her. And they were to, you might say, go hand in hand through life as a suitable helper. And you read that in the Old Testament, you read that in the New Testament about husbands and wives and how they're to treat each other. And one's not any better than the other. One's not smarter than the other. God has just given them different roles and different functions. And so he says, for this reason, the woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. It's still about authority. The angels, they have a distinct role in God's plan. Men and women have distinct roles in God's plan. God created the angels, gave them a special role, and theirs is different than men and women's. So we all have different roles. There's distinctions between angels and men and women. There's distinctions between all of us. But they're all important. The roles of women, the roles of men, the roles of angels, those are all important in God's plan. And that's obviously the best plan because that's what God does. He does things in the best possible way. And so when men and women, as he says there in the city of Corinth, when they obey these distinctions, then they're pleasing God by doing it. And of course we should too. Angels are subject to God. Men are subject to God. Women are subject to God. Everybody, regardless of their role, regardless of anything else, they're all in subjection to God. And that's the way God made it. Nevertheless, verse 11, neither is man independent of woman, nor woman independent of man in the Lord. For as woman came from man, even so man also comes through woman. But all things are from God. That's the way God created it. He created man and woman. He gave them distinctions. And in those societies that do away with those distinctions, those are not submitting to God's will. And there's another reason why marriages are not to be between two males or two females. God made it very clear. The proper role is for a male and a female, a man and a woman. And people who go away from that sin in God's eyes. All things are from God. He is the ultimate authority, and everybody is in submission to Him, whether they think they are or not. Judge among yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? And again, that's true in Corinthian society in the first century. It's not true today, but it was true then because it was a custom. Just like, Ephesians 2 talks about how by nature we were children of wrath. Well, that's not because the natural world tells us we're children of wrath. It's because we have become that way by habit and custom. It's basically the same word, the same idea. So does not even nature itself teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a dishonor to him? Well, again, that was culture. There's a lot of cultures that long hair doesn't have anything to do with it. But if it would become that way in our society, then again, Christians have to be concerned about that. But if a woman has long hair, it's a glory to her, for her hair is given to her for a covering. And then this kind of goes back to the idea of covering and not covering, and the idea of submission and authority. So when it says, does not even nature itself teach you that, we're not talking about the natural world, because nature doesn't teach us that. All right, animals and plants and photosynthesis and the natural world doesn't teach us anything about bringing glory to God. That's, but when you think about custom and a long custom, that's makes a lot more sense. But men and women, they do need to be distinct. That even goes back to the Old Testament, in some of the Mosaical law regulations. There are regulations about men and women being distinct. God has always wanted men and women to be distinct. This, again, kind of goes against transsexuals today and goes against a lot of the homosexual beliefs. God made men a certain way, made women a certain way, and He doesn't want anybody to deviate from that. If they deviate from those ideas, then they're going against God. I mean, it's just very plain and simple. They're going against God. But if anyone seems to be contentious, we have no such custom, nor do the churches of God. And of course, men and women do need each other, but he says he doesn't want it to be something that is contentious. All right, this is something that was obviously causing a problem in Corinth. The thing that was the most important is verse 3. God is the ultimate authority. And that's what's most important. And so when he talks about, we have no such custom, again, that's the idea of this established practice or habit. So that's the same word when, remember when, was it Pilate that asked the the crowd, it's your custom that I release someone at this time of year. Well, that was the same thing. That's the same word. It's this long custom or habit. It's established practice. So there was nothing, in that society, men and women had to be very careful about these head coverings. And again, we're not talking about just a little hat. That does not fit the context at all. But a full head covering. Well, that was a custom in Corinth. It wasn't a custom all over the world, but it was in Corinth. And so there's a lot about how, the environment in which you live. Maybe one day it would be that all women who were immoral would carry a red purse. And that's how you identified immoral women. Oh, they carried a red purse. Well, Christian women would have to stop carrying red purses. But it was that's just a custom or a habit. All right. Nowadays, if a woman carries a red purse, it just means that's the purse she picked up that morning to take with her. Doesn't have any significance. Head coverings does not have any significance today in our culture. Some cultures, again, you go to some Islamic countries and that's part of their culture, head covering. It's not in the United States. If you go to Japan, they have certain customs that you would have to be careful about. All right? Japan is a very singular race country. And so if you went there, you would want to, kind of obey those customs as long as they didn't go against God's word. So I think that's what we can get from this section, is that men and women do need to be distinct. They have different roles. That's what's so important. They have different roles. All of them, men and women, both have to submit to God. There isn't anyone that does not have to submit to God. If they don't submit to God in this life, they certainly will in Judgment Day. But everybody is responsible for submitting to God, regardless of who they are and where they live. Everybody's responsible. Now, that responsibility may look different in different cultures, but they still have to obey God. They have to submit to God, one way or the other. So that's kind of it's kind of like the holy kiss. We talk about how you greet one another with a holy kiss. Well, that's not part of our culture. If I would start to kiss everybody that I greeted, they'd probably put me away somewhere. It's not part of our culture. But what Paul would do, like he does here, is he defines what that kissing was supposed to be. It's supposed to be a holy kiss. So kissing was just part of the culture. Where wearing veils or not wearing veils, that was part of the culture in Corinth. But Paul is telling them how to make it holy. And he does that in a very direct way. This is how to make men and women wearing or not wearing veils. This is how to make it holy. This is how to make it Christian. Just like the holy kiss. Well, the next thing, and Lord willing, we'll do this next week. Now he starts talking about the Lord's Supper. This was another issue in the church at Corinth, and some of the Christians were not partaking of it like they were supposed to. So Paul instructs them about how it needs to be done. This is how you do the Lord's Supper. Of course, it was established, back in the early 30s. And Corinth, we're talking about the 60s. So the idea of the Lord's Supper has been around for 30 years. But the church at Corinth wasn't established that early. So he's going to direct them about this is the proper way. This is the proper way to do it. So, Lord willing, that's what we'll get to next Sunday morning.